The sealed orders arrived on a stormy Friday evening at Fort Bragg. I remember because the rain was hammering against the windows of my office, creating an ominous drumbeat that seemed to match the pounding of my heart as I broke the classified seal. As Captain James Walker, I'd led dozens of high-risk missions across the globe, but something about this one felt different from the moment I opened that envelope. The paper inside was crisp, official, and oddly sparse on details. Northern Maine, search and rescue possibly, classification level higher than anything I'd seen in my 15 years of service. The briefing would be in 3 hours, and I was to assemble my best team. I leaned back in my chair, memories of my last mission in Afghanistan flashing through my mind. The mountain caves, the insurgent camp, the precision with which my team had executed the extraction. We were the best at what we did, but this mission brief had my instincts screaming. In all my years of service, I'd never seen such an intentionally vague operational outline. My phone buzzed. Master Sergeant Derek Thompson, my demolitions expert, was already responding to my text. Thompson and I had served together for 8 years, since that bloody night in Kandahar when he'd saved my life by spotting a nearly invisible tripwire in a darkened doorway. His eyes missed nothing, and his hands could disarm anything from a homemade IED to a sophisticated Russian mine. Sir, I'm in, but have you seen the weather reports for Maine? Something strange going on up there. Thompson's message was typical of him, straight to the point, with an eye for details others might miss. He was right about the weather. The satellite images showed bizarre storm patterns that meteorologists couldn't explain. I spent the next hour making calls. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez was easy to convince. Our communications expert was always eager for a challenge. He'd gotten us through situations where every other form of communication had failed, rigging up solutions with little more than spare parts and sheer determination. His ability to maintain contact in the most hostile environments had saved our lives more times than I could count. Sergeant First Class David Wilson, our medical expert, was harder to reach. When he finally called back, I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. He'd just finished a 48-hour shift at the base hospital, but he didn't hesitate when I asked. Wilson had patched up wounds that should have been fatal, kept men alive in conditions that defied modern medicine. If something went wrong on this mission, he'd be the difference between life and death. Sergeant First Class Thomas Anderson was at the range when I found him. Our sniper, our eyes, our guardian angel. Through his scope, he'd watched over us on 4 continents, taking impossible shots and keeping us safe from threats we never even saw coming. The precision of his work was legendary within the unit. He was cleaning his rifle when I approached, those steady hands moving with practiced grace. Staff Sergeant Christopher Mitchell was the last to join. Our intelligence specialist had an uncanny ability to piece together patterns from seemingly random information. He'd been analyzing satellite data of the Maine region before I even reached him, his desk covered in printouts of thermal imaging scans and topographical maps. The briefing room was cold when we assembled 3 hours later. The officer who briefed us wasn't from any branch I recognized, his uniform lacking standard identifiers. The lights dimmed, and the first satellite image appeared on the screen. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying an edge I didn't like. "What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. 3 weeks ago, we lost contact with a military research team in northeastern Maine. 2 days later, we lost contact with the search party we sent to find them. Yesterday, we lost contact with the third team." The room was silent as he clicked through images. Abandoned camps, equipment left behind, strange markings on trees that made my skin crawl just looking at them. The briefing officer's next words would set us on a path from which there would be no return. "Your mission is simple on paper, find our missing personnel. But I want to be clear, something is happening in those woods that we don't understand. Your secondary objective is to locate and secure any research materials you find." The facility they were studying. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Let's just say it dates back to experiments conducted during World War II, experiments that should have remained buried." As we left the briefing room, I caught Thompson's eye. He'd noticed it too, the way the officer's hands had trembled slightly when showing certain photos, the deliberate vagueness about what exactly we might find. We'd been given the highest level of clearance I'd ever seen, yet the actual information we'd received could have fit on a post-it note. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Rodriguez triple-checked our communication gear, adding redundancies I'd never seen him use before. Wilson packed enough medical supplies for an army, including some specialized equipment I didn't recognize. Anderson methodically cleaned his rifle again, though it was already spotless. Mitchell pored over maps, marking locations of unusual satellite readings. The heavy rain continued as we boarded the helicopter that night. Looking at my team, I felt a mix of pride and concern. We were the best, but something in my gut told me we were heading into something far beyond our training. As the chopper lifted off into the stormy sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that some of us wouldn't be coming back. The Maine wilderness stretched below us, dark and forbidding. Our pilot, clearly unsettled by the strange weather patterns, kept checking his instruments. The storm around us seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, lightning flickering in patterns that defied normal meteorological behavior. None of us knew it then, but we were about to face something that no amount of military training could have prepared us for. Something ancient, something evil, something that had been waiting in those dark woods for a very long time. Little did we know, this was just the beginning of our descent into a nightmare that would challenge not just our survival skills, but our very understanding of reality itself. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing, the rotors whipping the rain into stinging sheets. The moment our boots hit the ground, something felt wrong. The forest around us was unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Just the dying thrum of the helicopter blades as our pilot lifted off, leaving us alone in the darkness. Rodriguez immediately began setting up our communication equipment, his practiced movements illuminated by the dim glow of our tactical lights. "Captain," he called out, his voice tense. "Something's not right with the frequencies. There's some kind of interference I've never seen before." I moved to his position, watching as he adjusted dials and checked connections. The radio emitted nothing but static, occasionally broken by what sounded like whispers in a language none of us recognized. Thompson, who'd been securing our perimeter, returned with an unsettling report. "Sir, you need to see this," he said, gesturing toward the tree line. We followed him about 50 yards from our landing zone, where his flashlight beam illuminated a series of strange markings carved deep into the bark of an ancient pine. They weren't military symbols, nor any kind of trail markers I'd ever encountered. They seemed to pulse with a faint phosphorescence, a sickly green glow that made my stomach turn. Wilson knelt beside a patch of ground nearby, his medical training drawing his attention to something the rest of us had missed. The soil was discolored, and not just from the rain. "This is blood," he said quietly, "but it's wrong somehow. The oxidation pattern, it's not possible. Blood doesn't behave like this." Anderson had taken up an overwatch position on a small rise, his scope scanning the darkness. "Movement at our 2 o'clock, he reported through our tactical comms, about 200 meters out, but he hesitated, something I'd never heard him do before. "Sir, it's not moving like anything I've ever tracked." Mitchell was already pulling out his tablet, correlating our position with his earlier research. "We're less than a kilometer from where the first team went dark," he informed us. Their last transmission mentioned finding similar markings. They were following them to some kind of structure. A sound echoed through the trees. Not quite a scream, not quite a howl. Something between the two that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Every member of my team instinctively moved into a defensive position, weapons ready, backs to each other. We'd been in combat zones across the world, but this was different. This felt like we were being hunted. "Form up," I ordered, my voice steady despite the growing sense of wrongness. "Anderson, take point. Thompson, watch R6. We're moving toward that structure, but we do this by the book. Something happened to 3 other teams out here, and we're not going to make the same mistakes." We moved through the forest like ghosts, our movements silent despite the wet undergrowth. Every few hundred meters, we found more signs of the teams that had come before us. A dropped magazine, its brass ammunition turned green with corrosion that should have taken years to form, not days. A shredded backpack that looked like it had been torn apart by something with impossible strength. More of those glowing symbols, growing more numerous as we pressed on. The rain had stopped, but the air grew thicker, heavier, making it difficult to breathe. Our tactical lights began to flicker, the beams seeming to bend in impossible ways. Rodriguez's radio continued to pick up fragments of transmissions, broken voices speaking words that seemed to skitter away from comprehension. "Captain," Mitchell called out softly, pointing to his tablet's display. "These readings, there's some kind of energy signature ahead. It's massive, but it's not showing up on any normal spectrum. It's like there's a hole in reality up there." The trees began to thin, revealing what looked like an old concrete bunker embedded in the hillside. The entrance was partially obscured by vegetation, but even from a distance, we could tell it wasn't completely abandoned. There were signs of recent activity, fresh boot prints in the mud, modern security cameras mounted above the entrance, their red lights dead and dark. But it was what was carved around the doorway that made us all stop cold. The same symbols we'd been following, but here they were arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at, like an optical illusion that twisted in on itself. And they were all glowing, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of our hearts. Thompson, our demolitions expert, examined the door mechanism. "This isn't World War II tech," he muttered. "This is modern, high-security stuff. But..." He ran his fingers along the edge of the frame. "Something's damaged it from the inside. Whatever did this, it was trying to get out, not in." A deep vibration rumbled through the ground, and for a split second, all of our electronics went dead. In that moment of complete darkness, we all heard it, a voice, impossibly deep, speaking words that felt like ice in our veins. When our lights came back on, we saw that the door had silently swung open, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow our weapon lights. Mitchell swayed slightly, pressing his hand to his head. "The readings," he gasped. "They're off the charts. Whatever's down there, it's waking up." I looked at my team, each man's face a mask of determination tinged with fear. We'd come too far to turn back now. Whatever horror awaited us in the depths of that bunker, whatever had taken 3 teams before us, we had a job to do. "Check your weapons," I ordered, "and stay tight. We're going in." As we crossed the threshold into that dark maw, none of us could have imagined the nightmares that awaited us in the depths below. The true horror of Project Eternal Warrior was about to be revealed, and not all of us would live to tell the tale. The initial corridor descended at a steep angle, our boots echoing on metal grating that had been installed over older concrete steps. The air grew colder with each level we descended, carrying an acrid smell that burned the back of our throats. Wilson quietly distributed filter masks from his medical kit, but even those couldn't completely block the stench of decay and something else, something chemical and wrong. 5 levels down, Thompson whispered, counting the landings we'd passed. Structures bigger than anything on the surface map showed. "This place goes deep." Our lights revealed modern security checkpoints mixed with older infrastructure, like the facility had been continuously updated over decades. Every door we passed had been torn open from the inside, the metal warped and twisted by forces that shouldn't have been possible. The walls were lined with the same symbols we'd seen outside, but here they had been carved with desperate, frenzied strokes. Mitchell stopped suddenly at one of the security stations, his tablet displaying readings that made him pause. "Captain, look at this." He pointed to an active computer terminal, its screen flickering with dying power. Someone tried to send a message out 2 days ago. Rodriguez plugged a data drive into the terminal, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The message appeared, fragmented but readable. "Cannot contain it. Project parameters exceeded. Original subjects manifesting beyond physical limitations. Do not attempt rescue. Destroy the facility. They're in the walls. They're in our minds. The old ones are..." The message cut off there. A video file was attached, but it was corrupted. Rodriguez could only recover a few frames. They showed a military research lab in chaos, personnel running from something just out of frame. The final image froze on a researcher's face, his eyes wide with terror as something dark and formless loomed behind him. "Sir," Anderson called from his position covering our rear. "Something's moving in the shadows. I can see it in my scope, but it's not right. It's like the darkness is flowing against itself." Before I could respond, a scream echoed up from the levels below. Not the inhuman howl we'd heard outside, but a human cry of pure terror. Mitchell checked his tablet. Life signs, level 7. Multiple readings, but they're flickering. "That's where we're going," I ordered, knowing we might be heading into a trap but unable to ignore potential survivors. "Thompson, what explosives did you bring?" He patted his pack. "Enough to bring down the whole facility if we need to, sir. Everything from shaped charges to incendiary devices." We moved deeper into the facility, passing laboratories filled with equipment both ancient and modern. The walls were lined with observation rooms, their reinforced windows shattered outward. Inside one lab, we found evidence of the original Project Eternal Warrior, yellowed photographs showing soldiers being subjected to strange rituals, their bodies marked with the same symbols that covered the walls. Wilson stopped to examine a medical file left open on a blood-stained desk. "They were trying to create immortal soldiers," he said, his voice tight with disgust. "But they weren't using science. This is something else. They found old Native American burial grounds, places of power. They were trying to tap into something they didn't understand." Another scream, closer this time. We picked up our pace, weapons ready. The next level down was flooded with ankle-deep water, the liquid black and unnaturally warm. Our lights reflected off its surface in ways that defied physics, creating patterns that seemed to move with purpose. Mitchell suddenly stumbled, grabbing his head. "The readings, they're everywhere. It's like reality is coming apart down here." His nose began to bleed, and Wilson quickly moved to check his vital signs. That's when we heard it, a voice clear as day coming from Thompson's radio. "Help us, please. We're trapped in the ritual chamber. The containment field is failing. We can't hold it back much longer." Rodriguez shook his head. "That's impossible. No signal should be able to get through down here." And that voice sounded like Colonel Banks, I finished, who's been dead for 3 years. The water around our feet began to move against the slope of the floor, flowing upward along the walls. In our lights, we could see shapes forming in the liquid, faces, hands, bodies trying to pull themselves out of the viscous fluid. "Move," I ordered, and we ran. The next security door was intact, requiring Rodriguez's skills to bypass. As we waited, Anderson's steady hands shook for the first time I'd ever seen as he sighted down the corridor behind us. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "look at the thermal." I switched my tactical optics to thermal imaging and felt my blood run cold. The water wasn't water at all. In thermal, it showed as absolute zero, impossibly cold, and it was moving with purpose, forming into humanoid shapes that walked upright. The door clicked open, and we piled through. Thompson immediately began setting charges around the frame. "We need to seal it behind us," he explained, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the horror we'd just witnessed. The next chamber was massive, circular, with that same black liquid covering the floor, but flowing in impossible patterns, spiraling upward in the center of the room like a twisted fountain. Ancient symbols covered every surface, pulsing with that sickly green light we'd seen outside. Modern equipment lined the walls, monitoring devices, containment fields, power generators, all dark and silent. And there, suspended in the center of the liquid spiral, we saw them. The missing members of the previous teams, floating unconscious, or what we hoped was unconscious. Their bodies were changing, transforming into something that no longer looked entirely human. "Captain Walker," a voice called from the darkness, familiar yet wrong. "We've been waiting for you." Out of the shadows stepped a figure wearing a U.S. military uniform from World War II. His face was young, unscarred, perfect, but his eyes were completely black, and his smile was too wide, filled with darkness. "Welcome to Project Eternal Warrior," he said, spreading his arms wide. "We've achieved everything we set out to do. Immortality, power, transcendence. And now, you and your team will help us complete the final phase." The black liquid began to rise around us, cutting off our retreat. In the darkness, more figures emerged, wearing uniforms from every era of American military history, all with those same black eyes and horrible smiles. And behind them, something vast and formless stirred, something that had been waiting in this place since long before humans walked the earth. We raised our weapons, knowing bullets might be useless against whatever these things were, but ready to go down fighting. The horror of what Project Eternal Warrior had actually achieved was about to become terrifyingly clear. "Open fire," I shouted, and the chamber erupted in chaos. Our weapons blazed, the muzzle flashes illuminating the twisted faces of our enemies. The bullets struck true, but the holes they tore in the transformed soldiers simply filled with that same black liquid, sealing instantly. "The generator," Mitchell screamed over the gunfire, pointing to a massive device against the far wall. "It's powering something, some kind of containment field." His tablet was going haywire, the readings spiking off the charts. Thompson was already moving, pulling equipment from his pack. "I can rig it to overload," he called back, "but I need time." The thing wearing a World War II uniform laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. "Time? We have all the time in the world, Captain Walker. We've had decades to perfect this process. Your bullets can't harm us. Nothing can. We've transcended mortality itself." The black liquid was rising faster now, forming into grotesque shapes, twisted amalgamations of human and something else. I saw faces I recognized in those forms, members of the missing teams, their features distorted in eternal agony. Wilson grabbed my arm, his medical training giving him an insight the rest of us had missed. "Sir, look at their movements. They're all connected to that central mass. It's like a hive mind." Anderson had switched to his sidearm, his rifle useless in such close quarters. He was backing toward Thompson, providing cover as our demolitions expert worked frantically on the generator. "Captain," he called out, his voice steady despite everything. "We've got more coming up through the floor." Rodriguez was at a control panel, his communications expertise put to a different use as he tried to interface with the facility's systems. "The original team," he shouted. "They didn't shut it down, they were containing something that was here long before the military found this place." The World War II soldier's smile grew impossibly wider. "Smart boy. The Native Americans knew. They tried to warn us. This place, this was their prison for it. We thought we could control it, use it to create the perfect soldiers. Instead it used us." As if in response to his words, the massive shape behind him began to move. The darkness shifted, revealing something that made my mind recoil. A writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, of mouths filled with infinite teeth, of flesh that moved like liquid shadow. Mitchell screamed. Blood was pouring from his nose, his eyes, his ears. The readings, it's impossible. It's breaking reality itself. He collapsed, convulsing, as the thing reached for him with appendages that seemed to bend through dimensions that shouldn't exist. Wilson rushed to help him, but one of the transformed soldiers blocked his path. The thing that had once been human grabbed Wilson with inhuman strength, its hands beginning to sink into his flesh. Wilson's scream of pain turned to one of horror as the black liquid began to flow up his arms. Anderson didn't hesitate. He fired 3 perfect shots, taking the creature's head apart. The grip loosened enough for Wilson to tear free, leaving patches of his skin blackened and necrotic where it had touched him. "Thompson," I called out, desperation creeping into my voice. "We need that overload now." "Almost there," he shouted back, his hands flying over the generator's controls. "But sir, this whole place is going to go. The explosion will take us all." The central mass of darkness was expanding, filling more of the chamber. The World War II soldier spread his arms in a grotesque welcoming gesture. "Don't you see? This is evolution. This is transcendence. Let go of your mortality. Embrace eternity." I looked at my team, at Wilson treating Mitchell's seizures, at Anderson's grim determination, at Rodriguez desperately trying to find some weakness in the facility's systems. We were out of options, out of time. "Do it," I ordered Thompson. "Light it up." The thing in the darkness roared, a sound that contained the screams of every victim it had ever taken, every soul it had corrupted. The transformed soldiers surged forward as Thompson hit the final sequence on the generator. Reality itself seemed to buckle as the containment field began to overload. The symbols on the walls blazed with blinding green light, and the black liquid churned like a stormy sea. The ancient evil and its eternal soldiers howled in rage as the generator's whine built to a deafening crescendo. But we weren't done yet. We still had to survive what was coming next, and somehow find a way out of this nightmare before the whole facility collapsed around us. The true test of our survival was about to begin. The generator's overload sent waves of energy pulsing through the chamber. The black liquid recoiled from the bursts, giving us a brief opening. "Move," I shouted, helping Wilson get Mitchell to his feet. Our intelligence specialist was barely conscious, blood still trickling from his eyes, but he was alive. "The main shaft," Rodriguez called out, pointing to a massive industrial elevator shaft across the chamber. "It's our only way up." We fought our way through the chaos. Anderson took point, his sidearm barking as he cleared a path. Thompson covered our rear, throwing incendiary grenades that seemed to actually hurt the liquid creatures, the flames making them recoil and shriek in voices that sounded like dying stars. The World War II soldier's perfect face had begun to melt, revealing something infinitely worse beneath. "You cannot escape." His voice boomed, now a chorus of thousands of tortured souls. "We are eternal. We are infinite." The walls were starting to crack, ancient stone groaning as the generator's overload disrupted whatever power had held this place together for so long. The black liquid was going berserk, shooting up the walls and sealing in defiance of gravity, forming into increasingly nightmarish shapes. Wilson stumbled, the necrotic patches on his arms spreading. "Sir," he gasped. "Whatever that stuff is, it's still active, still trying to transform me." He pulled an auto-injector from his medical kit and jabbed it into his arm. Massive dose of antibiotics and antivirals might slow it down. We reached the elevator shaft, but the car was gone, the cables hanging loose in the darkness above. Thompson immediately started rigging his climbing gear. "I've got enough line for all of us, but it's going to be close." A deafening roar shook the facility. The central mass of darkness was changing, concentrating itself into something more solid, more purposeful. The transformed soldiers were being pulled back into it, absorbed into its growing form. "Captain," Anderson said quietly, his trained eye seeing what the rest of us had missed. "Look at the walls where that thing touches them. It's not just destroying them, it's erasing them, like they never existed." He was right. Where the creature made contact, reality itself seemed to unravel. The effect was spreading, consuming everything it touched, leaving behind patches of absolute nothingness that hurt to look at. "Up, now," I ordered. Thompson had the first line secured. Rodriguez helped Mitchell onto Thompson's back, and they started up the shaft. Wilson went next, fighting through the pain of his infected arms. Anderson covered our ascent, his remaining ammunition dwindling. The thing that had been the World War II soldier made one last attempt to stop us. It launched itself across the chamber, its form now barely humanoid. Anderson's last 3 rounds took it in what might have been a head, buying us precious seconds. I pushed Anderson toward the rope. "Climb, that's an order." He hesitated only a moment before grabbing the line and starting up. I took the last rope, my hands shaking as I secured the harness. Below, the darkness had finished transforming. What rose up from the depths was beyond description, a perfect void in the shape of madness, reaching for us with appendages that bent reality itself. The walls around it were simply ceasing to exist, creating an expanding sphere of nothingness that threatened to consume everything. The generator's whine had reached a fever pitch. Thompson's explosives were detonating in sequence, adding to the chaos. The whole facility was coming down, but I feared that wouldn't be enough to stop what we'd unleashed. My arms burned as I climbed. Debris rained down around us, the shaft groaning as the structure began to collapse. Above, I could hear Thompson shouting encouragement, urging us to climb faster. Below, the void was rising, consuming everything in its path. We were 3 levels from the surface when Mitchell started screaming again. "It's in my head," he shrieked. "Oh God, I can see what it is now. I can see where it came from." Wilson, despite his own pain, managed to reach over and inject Mitchell with a sedative. "Stay with us," he yelled. "Don't look at it. Don't think about it." The void was still rising, but slower now. The generator overload had weakened it, forced it to become more solid, more vulnerable. But that wouldn't last long. Nothing we had could truly destroy something like this. 2 levels to go. The shaft was starting to collapse above us. Thompson was using small charges to clear debris from our path, each explosion sending shockwaves through the disintegrating structure. Rodriguez, who had been monitoring his equipment even during the climb, suddenly called down. "Signal. I've got a signal. Rescue teams are on their way. 1 level left." I could see moonlight above us, filtering through the open entrance. The cool night air touched my face, carrying the smell of pine needles and rain. We were almost there. The void made one final attempt to stop us. The shaft filled with whispers, the voices of our loved ones, our fallen comrades, promising peace and power if we'd just let go. Mitchell began to weep, the voices clearly torturing his already fractured mind. Even Anderson's iron discipline wavered as the voice of his dead brother called out to him. "Don't listen," I commanded, my voice hoarse from the acrid air. "They're not real. Keep climbing." A massive tremor shook the facility. The generator's overload had reached critical mass. Thompson's explosives were detonating in chain reactions throughout the lower levels. The walls of the shaft began to crack, huge chunks of concrete and steel falling into the void below. Wilson's arms finally gave out, the necrotic infection having spread almost to his shoulders. He slipped, but Rodriguez managed to grab him, holding on despite the risk to himself. "I've got you, Doc. Just hold on." We cleared the shaft just as it began to collapse, rolling onto the wet ground outside the bunker entrance. Thompson was already moving, setting his remaining charges around the entrance. His hands flew with practiced precision, even as more of those twisted, liquid forms tried to follow us up. "Fire in the hole," he shouted, and we all dove for cover. The explosion was massive, collapsing the entrance and sealing the shaft. But we couldn't stop there. The void was still coming, still consuming everything in its path. The ground under our feet began to shake as the facility collapsed in on itself. "Run," I ordered, and we ran. Mitchell had to be half carried between Anderson and Rodriguez, while Wilson pushed through the pain of his infected arms. Behind us, the forest was coming alive with the sounds of approaching helicopters, the rescue teams Rodriguez had contacted. We made it about half a mile before the final detonation. The ground buckled and swelled like a living thing. A column of that absolute darkness shot into the night sky, its edges writhing with tentacles and mouths and eyes that shouldn't exist. For a moment, it seemed like it would keep rising, keep spreading, consuming everything in its path. Then the darkness began to fold in on itself. The void, weakened by the generator's overload and Thompson's explosives, started to collapse. The sound it made was beyond hearing, a scream that existed in dimensions we couldn't perceive. The very air seemed to twist and distort as reality rushed in to fill the space where nothingness had been. When it was over, where the facility had been was now just a massive sinkhole, filled with twisted metal and broken concrete. The rescue teams found us at the edge of the blast radius, all of us injured, but alive. Wilson was immediately evacuated for treatment. The infection had spread, but his quick thinking with the antibiotics had saved his life and his arms. Mitchell's mind had been touched by something beyond human comprehension. He would spend months in psychiatric care, drawing those same symbols over and over, muttering about the spaces between spaces. The official report, I knew, would never tell the true story. How could it? How do you explain to the world that in the darkness beneath Maine, we'd found something that predated humanity itself? That the military's attempts to harness its power had almost unleashed an ancient evil capable of unmaking reality itself? 2 weeks later, I sat in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon. The same officer who had given us the original mission was there, along with others I didn't recognize. They wanted to know everything, every detail, every observation, every theory about what Project Eternal Warrior had actually achieved. I told them what they needed to know, that the facility was destroyed, that the threat was contained. I described the transformed soldiers, the black liquid, the void, but I left out certain details. The words Mitchell screamed before we sedated him, the things Anderson saw through his scope that defied description, the contents of the files Thompson found and memorized before the facility collapsed. Some things, I decided, were better left buried. The nightmares haven't stopped. I don't think they ever will. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the darkness in the corners of my room is moving, flowing, trying to take shape. I've checked my arms 1,000 times for signs of that black infection. I've learned to avoid mirrors in the dark, afraid of seeing eyes that aren't my own looking back. But what truly keeps me awake at night is the knowledge that Project Eternal Warrior wasn't the only facility of its kind. In my final debriefing, I saw a map just for a moment before it was quickly hidden away. There were other sites marked, other places where the military had found thin spots in reality, where they'd tried to tap into powers they couldn't possibly understand. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, I swear I can hear whispers. They tell me that what we encountered in Maine wasn't destroyed, merely banished, weakened, forced back into whatever realm it came from. They whisper that it's still out there, still hungry, still waiting. And they whisper that next time, we won't be able to stop it.